This is a revision video of the biological approach to explaining OCD. And before we start that, I'd like you to draw the OCD cycle and not the thought bubbles around the outside. Those represent how people often feel if they have obsessive compulsive disorder. But in the middle, you can see the cycle. So at the top, it is obsessions, and that means that people have intrusive thoughts, and those thoughts cause them extreme anxiety. So they obsess about them, it leads to anxiety. And that means overwhelming, intense feelings of fear and worry about their intrusive thought. And so that anxiety will lead to the compulsion. So common compulsions that we would know about are things like obsessive hand washing or checking locks, and they will do their compulsion as many times as they feel is necessary until they feel relief. And so it could be that they don't just check a lock once, that they check over and over and over, and eventually they will feel relieved and that they're able to move on. However, it is a cycle, and so unfortunately intrusive thoughts will occur again. So have the OCD cycle to hand as we're going through the explanation, and we're looking at the biological reasons that this could occur. The basic assumption of the biological approach is that OCD will have a biological cause, and in the spec it talks about genetic explanations and neural explanations, so that's what we're going to look at. First of all, the genetic explanations. And so when we talk about genetics, we're talking about heritability, that we might have inherited genes from our biological parents that cause OCD, or at least make us vulnerable to it. But the first thing to say is that OCD is thought to be polygenic, meaning there's many genes rather than one single one that is involved in causing it. And in fact, researchers have found evidence that there's up to 230 different genes that could be involved in OCD. And there is also some evidence to suggest that different types of OCD may be the result of particular genetic variations. So I'm sure most people have heard of like hoarder's disorder, where people obsessively hoard belongings and can't let go of them. And if you look in the picture, that person's house is just like got all of their possessions like spilling out. That is actually a form of OCD. And then another form of OCD might be religious obsession. So the evidence is that perhaps different genetic variations lead to different forms of OCD. We're going to look at just two of the genes that might be responsible, and the first one that people may have inherited is the Compt gene. So Compt regulates the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine, and if you've got the right levels of dopamine, then dopamine is responsible for things like drive and focus and motivation. But if you have very, very high levels of dopamine, then it can be responsible for things like psychosis, where you lose touch with reality. And so researchers think that a faulty Compt gene gives people higher levels of dopamine, and that possibly links to the OCD cycle, because the obsessions, you've lost touch with reality and the obsessions actually feel real. Another gene that we're going to look at is called the SERT gene, and the SERT gene is responsible for the transport of the neurotransmitter serotonin. And if you're one of my students, then I would be asking you to put your serotonin hat on, because we know that when you put your serotonin hat on, you feel like you have a calm mind and a balanced mood. And so serotonin, that's what it does. So if you haven't got enough serotonin, you're not going to have a calm mood and a balanced mind. And so if you look at the OCD cycle, the lower levels of serotonin mean that anxiety is probably going to be really overwhelming, because serotonin allows you to have the calmness of mind and a balanced mood. So low serotonin levels are associated with OCD because they probably target the anxiety part of the OCD cycle. We're also looking at neural explanations. Now, first of all, these completely link in with what we just talked about with the faulty Compt gene and the faulty SERT gene. So when we're looking at abnormal levels of neurotransmitters, then we're talking about increased dopamine levels, which cause us to have OCD, and decreased serotonin. And so with the increased dopamine, there have been animal studies which have showed that when they artificially increase the amount of dopamine in animals, they showed these stereotype movements that were reminiscent or like very similar to the compulsive movements of people with OCD. And the decreased serotonin, so the decreased serotonin is thought to cause OCD. And what researchers have found is that when they give people antidepressant drugs that increase serotonin activity, that has been shown to reduce OCD symptoms, which makes them think that that's why it happens, that decreased serotonin is implicated, especially because other antidepressants that they tried that had less effect on serotonin didn't reduce the OCD symptoms. The other thing to say about neural explanations is that there may be faulty brain circuits or abnormal brain circuits. So the lower levels of serotonin that we've talked about cause areas of the brain called the caudate nucleus in the basal ganglia and the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC, to malfunction. So those areas of the brain are responsible for sending worry signals to the thalamus. And the thalamus acts like a relay. The thalamus is in the diencephalon in the brain, don't need to know that. But the thalamus is a relay station for many, many, many things. So what happens is the low levels of serotonin mean that minor worries are getting sent to the thalamus, but that ends up causing a worry circuit because the thalamus is a relay and it will probably think, like in my brain, thalamus thinks, oh, that's not a proper worry, and just sends it back to the orbitofrontal cortex. It's a relay station, so it's like, oh, don't need to worry about that. But then the orbitofrontal cortex thinks, oh, here's another minor worry, and so it ends up being a circuit. The orbitofrontal cortex sends it to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it back again about minor worries. And that could explain why people perhaps check things over and over again. And I've got a picture of some hair straighteners there, because hair straighteners is a classic. A lot of people are worried they haven't turned their hair straighteners off, and I don't worry about it at all. I have a routine with mine. I just unplug them and then I know that I put them back in the drawer and that's it, and I don't worry about it. But many people do, and people with OCD have this checking system, and perhaps it's their abnormal brain circuit where they have to go back and check over and over and over again. And it reminds me of a friend that I have, and she at one point in her life, she doesn't do it now, but at one point of her life, she used to have to take photos of her hair straighteners with the date on, so that when she went to work, she could check, even when she was at work, that she had unplugged her hair straighteners. And she said if she didn't, she'd have to go home and check. And when she got home, of course, they were unplugged, but it's the OCD that was causing that. Now, she doesn't do that anymore, and it's interesting that and we'll look at this in the evaluation, that sometimes stressful things in our life will trigger OCD episodes. So it's not for some people it wouldn't necessarily happen all the time, but for some people it does. But I just put those hair straighteners on because it's a classic example. So we're going to look at the evaluation points for the biological explanation, and first of all we're going to look at family and twin studies, because this is to do with research for the idea that we inherit genes for OCD, because the family and twin studies are looking at DNA and looking at genetics. So the first one is a family study, and there was an experiment with the experimental condition had 80 patients with OCD and 342 of their first degree relatives. And they compared those people to the control condition, which was 73 people without OCD and 300 of their first degree relatives. And what they found was that people with a first degree relative with OCD were 5 times more likely to have the illness compared to the general population. So that is research support to show, so your first degree relative might be a biological parent, and if your biological parent has OCD, you are 5 times more likely to have the illness yourself. We also look at twin studies when we are looking for evidence, for genetic evidence. So a meta-analysis of twin studies found that concordance rates for OCD in monozygotic twins were over twice that of dizygotic twins. And hopefully you will know that concordance means if one twin has it, so does the other one. And twin studies will always compare monozygotic to dizygotic twins because they want to see if there's a genetic influence. Monozygotic twins are identical and share 100% DNA. Dizygotic twins are unidentical and share 50% DNA. But if you think about twins, all of the twins tend to have a very, very similar environment, very similar upbringing. They've been born at the same time, they probably share a bedroom, they probably go to the same nursery, and they have the same teachers. So the environmental factors are very similar for both. The only difference between them really is their genes. And so we always find the concordance rates for monozygotic are higher compared to dizygotic, and that means we've taken out the environmental influence because they've all had a similar influence, they've all had a similar environment, but the dizygotic, just because one twin has it, it doesn't mean they're as likely to have it as the other one. So that means that there is some genetic influence for why we could have it. The other thing to say about the twin studies is that they think it's the occurrence of OCD that runs in families, not specific compulsions. So someone might have one variation of OCD or a particular compulsion, such as they might be obsessed about germs and dirt and have to wash their hands, and somebody else might have an obsession about checking locks, and so they might have to check hair straighteners or locks over and over again. That's not as important really as the first bit, that the twin studies show that there is, because of those higher concordance rates in MZs, it shows that there's a genetic heritability. The next evaluation point is a strength and a limitation, and it's to do with the diathesis stress model. Hopefully you know the word diathesis. If you don't, it means that if you have a diathesis, it means you've been born with a genetic vulnerability for something. So in this case, you've been born with a genetic vulnerability for OCD. So you might have a faulty Compt gene, or you might have a faulty SERT gene. However, it's called the diathesis stress model because it says that we've been born with a diathesis, we've been born with a vulnerability for something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get OCD in this case. It's saying that something stressful in the environment might be needed in order to trigger it, which could be a relationship breakup or a pandemic, or in this case, if you look at this picture here, it could be something positive like graduating university. So graduating university is a really positive thing because you've worked hard and you've got your degree. However, it does mean that there's going to be a big transition on the horizon because you're probably going to end up moving house and not being around the people like the friends you've had for the last 3 years, and it's going to involve a lot of change. And so for somebody who's vulnerable to OCD, perhaps got those faulty SERT or Compt genes, even though it's a positive experience, they are a vulnerable individual for OCD, and so it could have a negative outcome for them. It could trigger their OCD symptoms. And so it's a strength and a limitation because it's saying that, yeah, we are born with a genetic predisposition for OCD. And so that's the strength of it. It's acknowledging the biological influence of genes on that disorder. However, it's saying that those genes by themselves aren't necessarily going to cause OCD symptoms. It must require some environmental factors to trigger it. So that's why it's also a limitation. It's saying it's a combination of nature and nurture, or genes and environment. The next evaluation point is to do with the fact that the drugs that treat OCD are effective, and if the drugs that treat it are effective, that's a biological treatment. So if a biological treatment works, then it probably indicates that the biological explanation is valid. So the drugs that are usually used to treat OCD are antidepressants called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And hopefully from your biopsychology units, you know that when serotonin is diffused into the synapse, you can see the synaptic transmission on that picture. that the receptors will grab hold of it, and then that means the next neuron is less likely to fire because it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and that makes us feel, we get our serotonin hat on, it makes us feel like we have a calm mood and a balanced mind. So if you haven't got enough serotonin, you don't have that calm mood. So if you think about the word selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that means, so inhibit means stop, it means that those drugs are targeting in on the serotonin and they're blocking the reuptake, or they're stopping it, they're blocking it. And that means that the serotonin will stay in the synapse for longer, and so the receptors have more chance of binding with it and having that inhibitory effect on the next cell. So the research shows that SSRIs are an effective treatment for OCD, and that suggests that lower levels of serotonin are in part responsible for the disorder. So if the treatment is effective, that means that the explanation is probably also valid. A limitation of the idea about the polygenic genes is that the influence, it's like the implications of what we can do with this information about genetic inheritance is limited because the genes are polygenic, because there's so many involved. So if scientists are unable to pinpoint exact genes, then developing gene therapy to screen for OCD in a mother's fertilized eggs is likely to be extremely difficult. But also on top of that, even if it was possible, there's always going to be an ethical debate about aborting fertilized eggs that carry the disorder. And there's also the consideration about whether the genes may have other benefits. So this is a limitation. It's saying it would be very difficult to do, but even if you could, there's going to be that ethical debate about whether it should be done. And the last evaluation point is offering another alternative explanation for why people have OCD. So our explanation is biological. It's saying you've got faulty brain circuits, you've got lower levels of dopamine and serotonin, and those are probably influenced by the genetic issues of faulty Compt gene and faulty SERT gene. However, there is an alternative explanation which is on the opposite end of the approaches. So the biological approach says that your biology causes things, and the learning theories on the other side, like the behaviourist approach and social learning theory, they're on the opposite end of the spectrum on the approaches. They believe that all behaviour is learned. And so there is this idea that perhaps people might get OCD because of the two-process model. And you probably know the two-process model means that it involves both classical and operant conditioning to explain why people might have a particular condition, in this case OCD. So it suggests that OCD could be initiated through classical conditioning. So someone associates a neutral stimulus of, say, dirt with anxiety, and so they've associated things together that shouldn't really go, but that association is then maintained through negative reinforcement, which is operant conditioning. So every time they avoid the thing they're scared of, like dirt, or they get rid of it by hand washing, they feel intense relief, and that relief is experienced as negative reinforcement, and so that's how they've learned to keep repeating the same behaviours. And evidence for that model is the fact that there is a therapy, a behaviourist therapy called exposure and response prevention, which is very similar to systematic desensitization, where basically you kind of like, you have to experience the thing that you are not phobic about, that you are anxious about, but you're prevented from doing your compulsion, and that's kind of built up. And so that therapy is actually pretty effective, and scientists have found it's between 60 to 90% effective, psychologists that is. And so if the treatment is effective, then that suggests that perhaps the behavioural explanation is valid in at least some cases. So with this, it is a discussion point. Remember, all the evaluations are discussion. So you're criticising the biological approach and saying, look, it might not be a biological cause, it might be a behavioural cause, it might be that we've learned to have OCD, and that some people can actually get better from behaviourist treatment, and so therefore in some cases, maybe not all cases, but in some cases there could be this behavioural element as well. So now you need to do your revision out activities, which means doing something. So you've had the content, you've refreshed your memory, and you're like, yep, I'm super all over that, I know what that is. But you need to now actually do some consolidation activities so that you can remember. So you might want to do a short answer test, and if you're my students, you can download that from MS Teams. If you're not, there'll be a link in the description below. You might want to create an A3 poster that's very colourful and got loads of images on to help you encode the information that will outline and evaluate the biological approach. If you have the CAT textbook, the Complete Companion, then there are exam style questions on page 113, and you could try doing the 16 marker. So the 16 marker is discuss the biological approach to treating OCD. And if you get that as a straight question, then you know this is an extended essay because it's 16 marks, and the word discuss means outline and evaluate. And the weighting of the marks are that you've got 6 marks worth of AO1, so you've only got 6 marks to describe the theory of the biological explanation, and then you've got 10 marks of evaluation. So it's tempting to think, oh, I know all about this, and explain everything in great detail in why people have OCD according to the biological approach. But remember, you've only got 6 marks. You've got to allow yourself time for the 10 marks worth of evaluation. And I've put on here a possible structure. You don't have to follow this, but it's just a bit of help for anybody that thinks they might want to. With the AO3, the evaluation, the examiners talk about the depth-breadth trade-off. So you could perhaps talk about 3 evaluation points in much more detail, or 4 or 5 evaluation points in less detail. And those are your picture references.